The Chernobyl reactor exploded because an operator pressed the emergency stop button exactly as the Soviet engineers had designed it to fail. The operator's name was Leonid Toptunov, 25 years old, working the night shift at Reactor 4. At 1:23 in the morning on April 26, 1986, he reached for a single red button labeled AZ5. That button was supposed to be the safest thing in the building. Pressing it would drop more than 200 control rods into the core in 18 seconds and shut the reactor down cold. 5 seconds later, Toptunov was dead, and the Reactor 4 building had been blown apart. The largest peacetime release of radioactive material in human history was tearing into the sky over Ukraine. Here are the numbers from inside that control room. The reactor was sitting at 200 megawatts of thermal power. Within roughly 4 seconds of Toptunov pressing AZ5, peer-reviewed reactor physics models put the peak power excursion at 99 gigawatts thermal. That's around 500 times the power the reactor was running at, and roughly 10 times its full rated output. It's enough thermal energy to flash vaporize the water in the cooling channels in a single instant. The needles on every gauge in that control room slammed into the right edge of their scales and snapped. There's a precise phrase the physicists use for what happened. They call it the positive scram, and it means an emergency shutdown that adds reactivity to the reactor instead of removing it. In every Western nuclear plant ever built, pressing the emergency stop button is the safest action you can take. In the Soviet RBMK design Toptunov was operating, it was the single most catastrophic move possible. The Soviet engineers had known about this for at least 3 years before the accident. There were internal memos warning of the flaw. There were Soviet modeling studies confirming the same behavior. There were earlier reactor incidents inside the Soviet program documenting the identical end effect. All of that information was classified by Moscow, and the operators were never told any of it. So when Toptunov reached for the button that morning, he was reaching for a kill switch he had every reason to trust. He was reaching for the only tool his training had given him for the runaway he was watching unfold, and he was reaching for the one thing in the room that was guaranteed to detonate the reactor in the configuration he had it in. 3 things had to be true for that button to function as a detonator instead of a shutdown. 15 feet of solid graphite hanging below every control rod absorber, a reactor running far below its safe operating power, and only 8 control rods inserted in a core where the operating manual required at least 15. Toptunov's reactor had all 3 of those conditions running at the same time. Now imagine the design problem the Soviet engineers were trying to solve. Every nuclear reactor in the world runs on a chain reaction. A neutron strikes a uranium atom, splits it, releases 2 or 3 more neutrons, and those neutrons split the next atoms in line. To keep the reaction stable, you've got to control the population of neutrons inside the core. Too many neutrons, and the reaction runs away. Too few neutrons, and the reaction dies out on its own. Every nuclear reactor uses 2 materials to manage that neutron population. A moderator that slows the neutrons down so they can split uranium efficiently, and an absorber that swallows the neutrons whole and kills the reaction. In a Western pressurized water reactor, the same water that cools the fuel rods also serves as the moderator. Lose the water, you lose the moderator, and you lose the reaction. The whole system is inherently self-correcting on its own. Even if you do nothing, a loss of coolant accident slows the reaction down by itself. The RBMK reactor at Chernobyl was built backwards. Its moderator was solid graphite instead of water, embedded throughout the core in massive blocks. The water in the cooling channels actually absorbed neutrons, so when that water boiled into steam, the reaction sped up instead of slowing down. Peer-reviewed reactor physics quantifies this as a positive void coefficient of about $5 of reactivity. That's an enormous positive number for a power reactor. In Western reactors, that same coefficient is sharply negative. In the RBMK, it was the engine of a runaway. Now layer on the bizarre control rod design. Each control rod was built in 2 distinct pieces. On top, a boron-carbide absorber section that swallowed neutrons. On the bottom, separated by 1.25 meters of water, a 4.5-meter-long graphite displacer. 15 feet of moderator hanging below the absorber. When the rod was fully withdrawn, that graphite section was sitting centered in the active core. The water above and below it kept the local reactivity calm. When the operator pressed AZ5, the first thing entering the bottom of the core wasn't the boron absorber. It was more graphite, pushing the water out of the channel as it went. For about 3 seconds, every one of those 200-plus control rods was adding positive reactivity to the bottom of the core. 3 seconds was more than enough time to trigger the runaway. In a reactor already running at high flux, low xenon, and low operating margin, that brief graphite insertion lit the fuse. The reaction in the bottom of the core went prompt critical in milliseconds. The fuel temperature spiked past every threshold the engineers had imagined. The water in the cooling channels flashed instantly into steam. The reactor's void coefficient slammed hard into positive territory. The chain reaction multiplied past every safety margin. Every needle in the control room snapped off its post. 2 distinct explosions followed within the next second. The first was a steam explosion that lifted the massive concrete reactor lid off the building and threw it sideways. The second is still debated by physicists, but the leading theory is a small nuclear excursion in the disrupted fuel itself. Either way, the building was open to the sky and the graphite was on fire. A significant fraction of the reactor core was scattered across the surrounding forest. The men in the control room had pressed the emergency stop button 5 seconds earlier. The reactor had obeyed them in the most catastrophic way possible. What killed Leonid Toptunov 14 days later was an absorbed radiation dose of around 15 gray. 2 of his colleagues died at the plant that same morning, one from the blast itself, one from his injuries. By 6 in the morning, 28 more first responders and operators died of acute radiation syndrome inside the first 3 months. Their absorbed doses ranged from less than 1 gray to over 16. The United Nations Scientific Committee on the Effects of Atomic Radiation logged 134 documented cases. About 600 plant personnel were on site that night. Most of those men were young and most were trained. Almost none of them had been told that the kill switch they trusted would behave the way it did. The Soviet response was to fix the reactor and blame the operators for the disaster. A 1986 commission accused the night shift of violating procedures. A 1992 update from the International Atomic Energy Agency reversed that conclusion. The reviewers had far more access to the actual reactor data. They wrote that the accident was caused by design flaws in the RBMK, and the operators had no way to compensate for them. The reactor's void coefficient was substantially reduced. The Scram insertion time was cut from 18 seconds down to 12. The graphite displacer follower sections were completely redesigned. Every remaining RBMK reactor in the former Soviet Union was retrofitted before it was allowed to restart operations. But the lesson the rest of the nuclear engineering world took away was deeper than a retrofit. The instinct to design a kill switch with a fast-acting safety feature becomes the mechanism of disaster. It triggers the moment the system underneath the switch responds the wrong way. The AZ5 button wasn't the cause of Chernobyl. The cause was a decision made years before any operator was hired. They built a reactor where slamming the absorbers into the bottom of the core also slammed graphite into the bottom of the core. The button just enforced the choice the engineers had already made. If a single button destroying a reactor in 5 seconds shocked you, watch what BP did when their pressure test failed on Macondo. That video's right here on Sketchy Science.